his fourth appearance at the Secret Society Twisted Storytellers, Mr. Doug Howell.
The year was 1954. I was standing in the front room of the house that I grew up in, by the bottom of the stairs that led up to the bedrooms in our house, when I first remember my father hitting me hard enough to knock me unconscious. Wasn't the first time he hit me. Wasn't the last. I learned early on in my life to hate my father. That day, as I came to and I struggled with my equilibrium to stand back up and wait for him to hit me again, it was at that moment, that exact spot, that I let him go. He was no longer part of me. I was 8 years old. I saw my father as an alcoholic. He would come home from work, sit in the big chair in front of the TV and drink glass after glass of vodka, creme de menthe, and he smoked 2 or 3 packs of Newports a day. He never had anything nice to say to us kids at all. It was always demeaning and derogatory. So he was not exactly who I wanted to be around. I was the second born. My oldest brother, to him, my father just completely ignored him. To me, pretty much his only communication with me was to ask me, "What's wrong with you?" To my next youngest brother, he did the most unconscionable thing of all. He denied him his paternity. So 3 of us, oldest boy and my sister, we pretty much grew up on the streets. Not that my father ever noticed. He gave me no ambitions, no goals in life. He was not a role model that I could look up to. Every summer, they would ship us off to church camp for 2 weeks. That was a lot of fun for us, away from home and meeting new people. My last summer before I graduated, I met a girl. Her name was Sybil Carter. Sybil was a black girl who went to high school in Ithaca, New York, about 80 miles south of me. We pretty much fell in love, and Sybil treated me kind. She was gentle. She made me feel special. She made me feel like maybe there wasn't something wrong with me. But I did everything I could to keep that relationship. And I had a long-distance relationship before I even knew what that was. But in way up northern New York, in ultra-conservative territory, I learned very quickly that a white boy going out with a black girl didn't gain me a lot of friends. I saw my father as weak, and so I did everything I could to spite him, and so I tried to become really strong, physically strong. He loved to tell us how smart he was. I became a poor student. That'll show him. In my high school, there was about 240. There was only one high school in town. There was about 240 kids, and I think my ranking was 235th or something like that. Whatever. I don't want to give you the wrong impression, though. I had a fairly normal kind of time in high school. I got involved in sports, which did 2 things for me. Number one, it kept me away from my father in the house a little bit longer. I would leave really early in the morning to go work out at school, and then I'd stay after school and work out again later in the evening. And it also kept me in healthy habits. Lord knows I could have gone on down a different route. Well, my senior year, I had planned on going to college on a wrestling scholarship, but a shoulder injury dashed those hopes, and I certainly wasn't going to get into college on my scholastic abilities. So the only way I was going to be able to get out of town and away from my father was to join the service. So I joined the Navy. I went to boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Training Center north of Chicago, and after boot camp, I went to hospital corps school, and I became a Navy hospital corpsman. And probably 2 months into my very first duty station, true to my nature, I got bored, and I wanted out. Yeah, right, because that wasn't happening. So I asked for a transfer into the Marine Corps, which they quickly granted me. Lucky me. Yeah. Well, I was rewarded with being assigned to India Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. And this company was designated a part of a special landing force for the war that was building in Southeast Asia. We had extensive trainings in both daytime and nighttime, different ambush techniques, search and destroy missions, and extensive training in both vertical and amphibious assaults, that is, by air and by sea. We did jungle survival training in the Philippines. We were a pretty tough outfit. My time in the Marine Corps, I forgot about my father. I began to see my platoon commander as a surrogate parent. I'm sure I'm not the only young man that happened to. Lieutenant Sam Williams was all things I thought my father was not. He was loyal. He was brave. He was honest. Kind of sounds like a Boy Scout. He was trustworthy. He distinguished himself in combat. He was awarded the second highest award for valor that our country can bestow, the Navy Cross. He is a true American hero. I would have followed him anywhere. I looked up to him. Well, likewise, our unit, my company, was also well distinguished in combat in Vietnam and well decorated for our tenacity in battle. Particularly one battle where we found ourselves on the border of Laos, up at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, way up in the corner of South Vietnam, and we had crested a ridge and found ourselves in an ambush by a regiment of the North Vietnamese Regular Army. Now, in those days, a regiment of North Vietnamese Army consisted of 600 men. Once they had sprung the ambush, they quickly surrounded us. They cut off all escape routes. And once they had us isolated on that very small hilltop, they began shelling us with mortars in between attempts at breaking through our lines, getting inside and finishing us off. As the hours of that fight raged on through that first day and first night, and with every hour the number of dead Marines and mortally wounded Marines kept climbing, it seemed obvious that India Company was going to be eliminated. I thought, as well as every other man on that hilltop thought, we were not going to see the next morning. but with an unbelievable number of incredibly heroic acts of bravery by nearly every single Marine on that little tiny hilltop. And through good old-fashioned United States Marine Corps grit and determination, we extricated ourselves from that fight, that hilltop. However, of the 180 Marines that went over that crest of that hill that morning and faced that 400 to 600 man North Vietnamese, only 63 of us walked off 48 hours later. For that one fight, our company was awarded 118 Purple Hearts, 4 Bronze Stars, 3 Silver Stars, a Navy Cross, as I mentioned before, and a Medal of Honor. We are a very well-decorated company. And I'm not the only person who thinks we are one of the toughest Marine Corps units the United States has ever put into harm's way. My father didn't write to me when I was in Vietnam. My mom did some. But Sybil wrote to me nearly every single day. And I saw her letters as my connection to home, my connection to the real world, as we used to call it. And when we came home, we landed in California, and they gave tickets to our final destinations, plane, train, bus. I asked for a ticket to Buffalo, New York, because that's where she was attending university, rather than go to my home. And we were so happy to see each other. That first night, she wanted to take me out and have a beer and listen to some music. And we go to this little club, and I can't remember. I think it was on campus. I'm not sure, but it doesn't matter. There's this little tiny place, and it was really dark, and there were little lights on each of the tables, and the band was playing so loud, and people were laughing and talking really loud over the music, and they were all packed together really tight, and I had just come out of the jungle where the slightest little noise would alert the enemy to my presence and get me or my brothers killed. And I'm saying to myself, oh God, one little grenade will fuck up a lot of people here. And I started having a panic attack. And I told Sybil I couldn't do it. I couldn't stay there. So at midnight that night, she put me on a bus to home. And we kissed and said goodbye. And I think I cried for every single one of those 220 miles or so north to my home. I was so angry about feeling weak, about having just told my girlfriend that I did not know how to be with her. And there are only 2 places in the entire universe that I did not want to be, and I was headed straight for one of them. PTSD. Combat, especially intense combat over a long period of time and really close-in fighting where you and your enemy can see each other very clearly and very close, strips you of much of your humanity. You become your most base animal. And you're not fighting for mom or apple pie or America. You're fighting for your survival. Kill or be killed. You're fighting for your brother next to you. That never leaves you. That is with you forever. And so when you come home and you have to transition into civil society, it can become very awkward and very uncomfortable. Sitting at the family dinner table, pass the fucking salt, doesn't come over very good. By the same token, sleeping on the floor underneath your bed also appears like an aberration or something. My parents thought perhaps there was something wrong with me. I thought it was the safest place I could find. My mom one day took me to a place where there were some fireworks. Now, I knew they were celebratory. I knew they weren't aimed at me. I didn't think there was going to be death and dismemberment and ugliness like I was seeing in my dreams every night. But the explosive sounds and the flashes of light reminded me of that, and it triggered too much, and I began to have another panic attack, and I told my mom I have to go home. On the way home, she said to me, "Don't be a baby. You know, your father was in World War II." My father. First week I was home, my dad brought me to the local VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and it's just a little dingy bar underneath the building in a basement, kind of like a Rathskeller. And there's 5 or 6 guys in there drinking beers, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And after my father introduces us, these gentlemen began talking about their war, World War II, the best war, the real war, where there was real fighting. And I said to myself, these sorry-ass drunks wouldn't last 2 weeks in my Marine Corps. And I said to my dad, "Dad, you're going to have to take me out of here because I'm going to start a fight. I'm telling you right now." And my father looked at me and he said, "You can't blame them, son. That was a real war." And once again, he took from me any validation of my experience, validation of my life, my war. And I realized I could not be there. I could not be around him. I could not be in that town. So I packed a backpack and I stuck my thumb out. And I hitchhiked around the country for several years: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa, Nebraska, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Wisconsin. I spent the summer of '68 on Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. I spent a winter in Winona, Minnesota that was wicked-ass cold. Holy crap. I had more jobs than I could ever count. I did more things. And of all the people that I met in all of my travels, I'm sure now that they all thought I was homeless. I knew where my home was. I knew exactly where it was. I just didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be in the presence of my father and his demeaning sarcasm. I didn't want to be in a town that could see me and know me. They could see the guilt I had of surviving. They could see the guilt I had for not being brave enough to die on that hill or in any of the other battles that we had. And so I stayed away. But as time went on, I began to get a better sense of myself, and I began to keep jobs a little bit longer and begin to settle down. I even managed to get through university, and through all those post years, I've probably had about 35 years of psychiatric counseling. Most of it helped me a great deal. Helped me through 2 failed marriages, helped me raise 2 sons, helped me through normal things that people go through as well, financial difficulties and whatnot. The subject of my parents came up quite often. I dealt with my mom. That wasn't all that difficult. But I could never deal with my father. My disdain for him was so deep that I could not objectively discuss my relationship with him. In 1993, I was living and working on the East Coast. And my company asked me to move to Detroit for a job. I said, "Detroit? My father grew up in Detroit. Why would I want to go there? But they offered a really nice incentive. And so in October of 93, I moved to Detroit. I lived in an apartment on Selden between 2nd and 3rd. And I found another psychologist, a great lady that helped me with lots of things. And she knocked on my father's door many, many times, but I always rebuffed her. However, one day I walked into her office and I sat down, and she immediately pulled up an empty chair right in front of me. And she said, "Your father's sitting in that chair. What do you have to tell him?" Okay, well, that was a pretty emotional session because I finally let it out. I told him about every transgression. I told him about every time he did not come to one of my sporting events. Every time I needed support and he gave me sarcasm. Every time I needed love and he gave me a demeaning look. I told him about every failure. And my shrink said to me, "Do you think your father was an emotionally strong man?" I said, "No," I admitted. I did not think he was strong at all. I thought he was weak and unsure of himself and his place in this world. She said to me, "Do you think your father knew how to be a parent?" And I said, "No. He did not know how to be a parent." And then she said to me, "Well, perhaps that was his failing." I said, "Oh, yeah, well, I hadn't thought of that." So the first time I started thinking a little bit differently about my father. So this is a man who dropped out of high school at the age of 17, joined the army and went to war. When he came back from war, he taught himself how to play the piano and how to play the cornet and how to read music. He taught himself how to sing. He had a beautiful tenor voice. He taught himself how to write. He wrote an opinion piece for our local hometown newspaper that was on the front page every Thursday. He became a public speaker. He had a fledgling acting career. In spite of what I thought of him, in spite of his struggle with alcohol, in spite of my feelings, he was a respected man in that town. And my shrink said to me, "Well, what are the things that you've done to make yourself strong and independent?" She said, "You joined the service when you were 17 and went to war. When you came home from war, you learned how to play music and write songs. And you taught yourself how to sing, and you have a very nice tenor voice. And you taught yourself how to write. I've written poetry. I wrote a book. I wrote articles for underground newspapers all across the country, California, Wisconsin, New York. And I struggled with alcohol. And I became a public speaker, a storyteller. And I came from a place where I thought I was weak and unsure of myself and my place in the world, just like my father. And for each of these things, she said, sounds a lot like your father." And she said, "Perhaps you have more of your father in you than you think." And my epiphany was this: I became strong enough to be proud of myself and my life and what I've accomplished. And I've become strong enough to recognize what my father took from me, and he took so much. But I also became strong enough to recognize his weaknesses, forgive him for not knowing how to be a parent and to accept and be grateful for the things that he did give me. And he gave me so much. My father was the last-born son of Reese Tudor Howell, who packed his family up when my father was 2 years old and moved from the country of Wales to the United States, where they landed in Detroit, Michigan, and they grew up. My father grew up on Lakeview Street on the Near East Side here. I am the second-born son of Robert Thomas Howell. And irony of all ironies, I now live in Detroit, Michigan, a city I love. I am a first-generation American. I am proud of my strong name. I am proud of my strong Welsh heritage. And I am my father's son. Thank you so much.
Doug Howell, ladies and gentlemen.